Born to Annoy, a dawning of awareness. Chapter 15. Erection. My next two mentors, namely Harry Brotherton and Johnny Johnson, were skilled fitters and the most experienced workers in the switchgear Erection Department. They were both quiet, thoughtful men and went about my training in a practical way. It didn't take me long to realise other apprentices in the Erection Department didn't fare so well. Fitters, like machine tool operatives, were employed on piecework. One or two of them viewed the apprentices as their labourers and treated them accordingly, reducing their young charges to mere fetchers, carriers and brew boys. Harry and Johnny worked as a team, and from the start made me part of that team. They took their responsibilities as my instructors and mentors seriously. I did my fair share of fetching and carrying, but so did they, just as all three of us took turns to make the brew. Perhaps more importantly, they involved me in the actual fitting process from day one, knowing that the best way to learn is through hands-on experience, even though this affected their bonus payments adversely. Most of our work was building control panels. This involved assembling the frames, attaching the sheet panels and the instrumentation, electrical relays, ammeters, watt meters, voltmeters, on-off switches and the like, prior to the control panels proceeding to the wiring department. Being a cyclist and always having maintained my own bike, I was of course familiar with the use of a spanner, but this was work of an entirely different nature. Within a few weeks of working with the two men, I could swing a spanner with the best. Like Maggie, they took pride in their work, and it soon became obvious they took pride in passing their skill and knowledge on to me. I responded accordingly, returned their respect, and gave of my best. Other apprentices, a minority it must be said, were not so lucky, and many were the stories they told of the effing bugger they were saddled with. One incident springs to mind at this point. It was a Monday morning. We'd had our morning brew and our usual review of the work in hand for the next few days. Johnny pointed out we were running short of nuts and bolts of a particular size. I volunteered to go to the small parts store to obtain them. When I arrived there, one of my fellow apprentices from Erection stood waiting. Dad appeared, and I handed over the requisition slip. He turned to my mate and said, "Won't be too long now." He then turned his back on the youngster, but as he did so, he winked at me, somewhat conspiratorially, before walking away to retrieve my order. I got the impression Dad was amused at something. The dimples had formed under his cheeks, as they always did when he smiled. "What are you here for?" I asked my friend. "A long stand," he replied. "Oh, how long have you been waiting?" "At least 20 minutes. Your dad says they're expecting them in any minute." "Don't you think 20 minutes is long enough?" "What do you mean?" "What I mean is 20 minutes is more than a long stand, you soft apeth." I laughed at him as a look of enlightenment crossed his face. "The effing bastard," he managed to articulate. "Yes," I commiserated, "and when the effing bastard asks you to get him a left-handed screwdriver, tell him to F off." Many were the tricks of this nature played on naive young lads by the adults. Most, of course, were simply motivated by a sense of good-natured fun, and the victims reacted accordingly. Once again, I was lucky in this regard. Maybe the adults automatically assumed Dad would have put me on my guard, although he never did. Whatever the reason, nobody seemed to play such tricks on me. Whilst I was working with Harry and Johnny, however, a much more tragic incident occurred. Nowadays, the health and safety regulations provide a great source of amusement and derision to many. In the 1960s, that was not the case. In fact, over a wide range of industries, engineering included, health and safety was a major concern, and often a great source of conflict between trade unions and the employers. After a long period of annual reductions in the numbers of serious injuries and deaths due to industrial accidents following the war, they were back on the rise again, and engineering was not an exception. The accident that brought this home to me involved an apprentice a couple of years older. In those days we were so busy that the company had a night shift as well as a day shift. A guillotine operator had been asked by a foreman to speed up the production of sheet steel panels for an urgent job. He instructed the machine operator to disable the automatic safety guard in order to save a few seconds' time on each cut of the blade, promising him that he'd be allowed to exceed the normal 200% piecework bonus without the rate fixers being involved. When the day shift commenced work, the daytime operator asked his apprentice to do a small job for him, completely oblivious to the events of the night before. The willing apprentice lost all his fingers on his right hand. His mentor, blaming himself, suffered a nervous breakdown. It was to have been the apprentice's final week in fabrication, prior to moving on to the wiring department. It turned out to be his last day in engineering, and all because an ignorant foreman, no doubt eager to impress his masters, was determined to get a job out a few minutes early, and a worker, his brain disengaged by the prospect of an extra 5 bob in his waist pocket, didn't have the sense, or maybe the courage, to tell him to F off. Labour was cheap and easily replaced. It still is. The management referred to this human tragedy as an unfortunate accident, words I was destined to hear much later in my life. However, it was obvious to me this event was no accident. The guard had been dismantled deliberately on the orders of a foreman acting on behalf of a manager to speed up the job in the interests of company profits. There is no such thing as an industrial accident, because all of them can be prevented, and it is only human greed that prevents them being prevented. Whenever I hear people taking the piss out of health and safety regulations, I remember this incident, and many's the time I've challenged them with the facts. All too often I find their ignorance is only matched by their intellect, or rather the lack of it. This incident also brought home something else to me. By this time, as you will have gathered, my class awareness was growing. Auntie Dolly, with her past references and hints, had planted the seeds. Maggie had tended and nurtured the process. She'd talked about the economic origins of class conflict, and sometimes its inevitability. But I hadn't really come to terms with the implications of her reasoning. I didn't like the idea of conflict, and didn't see why it should be particularly difficult for employers and workers to strive for a common end. However, I had by now realised that workers and employers had quite different economic interests, which were often all too clearly mutually antagonistic. Nonetheless, the members of both classes were capable of rational thinking, and therefore, I believed, they should be able to resolve their differences in favour of the greater good. If ever there was a question where my simplistic theories on the possibilities for class collaboration could be shown to be correct, this question of health and safety was surely it. You would have to be a very callous human being, to say the least, to be willing to sacrifice the health, limbs and life of a fellow human being for the sake of speeding up production. Surely the apprentice's ordeal was an isolated incident. Alas, I was wrong, and Red Maggie proved to be all too right. If I'd known then the consistent and horrific record of manufacturing capitalists on this question, from the dawning of the Industrial Revolution down to the modern day, I would never have doubted her. The unions had an uphill struggle to achieve progress on this question in the past, and, despite much greater public enlightenment, still have today. Ask the workers producing Apple and electronic products generally, if you doubt what I say, especially the friends of those driven to suicide. There's blood on the computer keyboard just as there was blood on the coal. It stained Lancashire's cotton, Manchester's engineering products, and not least the city's magnificent buildings. Not only that, But in recent times it has come to light that the workers most likely to be blacklisted by employers are those who draw the management's attention to health and safety issues. Now these are some of the facts. In 1960 there were more industrial accidents than there had been in any year since 1948, and a downward trend since 1948 had been reversed. In fact, most of the reduction since 1948 had taken place in coal mining. The nationalisation of the coal industry had given the miners control of their own health and safety regulations, and they, uniquely amongst all other working people, were responsible for their implementation. The result was a massive decline in accidents in coal mining. Unfortunately, this masked the continuing upward trend in other industries. 1958 marked the low point in the number of accidents. The following year saw a dramatic leap upwards again. In fact, 1959 witnessed the highest number of accidents for a decade. Accidents to young people, that is, those under 21, increased by 15%. For young males it was actually 17%. This trend continued in 1960. That year, the year I had started work, witnessed a further 4% increase in accidents in manufacturing industry involving male workers, and a massive 9% increase involving female workers over the previous year. By 1960, at least 4 people who arrived at their place of work in industry on any single morning would not leave their workplace alive the same evening, and another 2,500 would suffer serious injury. Multiply this by 365, less 2 weeks annual holiday and 7 bank holidays, and you begin to have an understanding of the carnage visited upon the working class. The factory inspectorate reported a number of varied causes. They included inadequate training, a failure on the part of firms to appoint safety officers, employers ignoring warnings from workers and their trade union representatives, faster and more complicated machinery, inadequate safety guards on machinery, coupled with increasing pressures on workers to achieve greater productivity rates. You, dear reader, may doubt my assertions. After all, I was no but a kid, and it was a long time ago. However, these are the facts as provided by the Factory Inspectorate and debated in the House of Commons on the 21st of December 1960, which you can easily check, because Hansard, the verbatim report of parliamentary proceedings, can be accessed for free online. Early in that year of 1961, whilst I was still working with Harry and Johnny, I received a pleasant surprise. A dramatic increase in my basic wage rate from £2.14 shillings and sixpence to £3 7 shillings and threepence. At first I thought the management must have suffered a sudden bout of philanthropy. All the more surprising, because I knew by then that philanthropy was not only in short supply, but a very dangerous disease from the shareholders' point of view, for it cost them profit and thus lower dividends. However, I soon discovered this wage increase was not the result of the boss's overnight conversion to a policy of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, but the result of an unofficial strike by the apprentices earlier in 1960, in the period before I had started work. Apprentices were not supposed to take industrial action under the terms of their indentures. Thus, the strike by definition was unofficial. It had been a nationally coordinated strike nonetheless, and received sufficient support from adult trade unionists in the form of finance for the apprentices to eventually win the day. Its main centres of support and militancy were Glasgow and Manchester. I was to learn much later in life that one of Manchester's most famous adopted sons, namely Manchester United's manager, Sir Alex Ferguson, had been one of the Glasgow strike leaders. I cycled back to Marple that Friday and informed my Auntie Dolly of my great good fortune. Her response was quick and decisive. "Have you joined the union yet, Malc?" "No, I haven't really been asked to." "Well, don't you think you should?" "Why?" "Would you expect to be able to jump on a bus without paying the fare on the grounds the bus had to pass where you wanted to go anyway? No? Then why should you accept the benefits of your fellow workers' strike action? What right have you to benefit from their sacrifice? They risk their jobs to win your wage increase. You don't want to be a freeloader, do you? End of discussion. Dolly had made her point. I visited Maggie first thing Monday morning and obtained an application form to join the Amalgamated Engineering Union. Although Maggie wasn't my shop steward, she was as pleased as punch, clutched me to her more than ample bosom, and then kissed me on the forehead, like a long-lost prodigal son. I know I'm on dodgy ground saying this, but if I'd realised how she'd react, I'd have joined the union months before. As it happened, she volunteered to propose my membership be accepted when the application was discussed along with others at the local monthly union branch meeting. Harry Brotherton volunteered to second Maggie's proposal. If Maggie and Auntie Dolly had ever met, goodness only knows what would have happened to Britain's political future. Slowly but surely my class consciousness was developing, and with it political awareness began to grow. This process was aided by a unique factory institution. Once a fortnight on a Wednesday, Harry Brotherton hosted a debating society around our workbench at lunchtime. On that day we brought in sandwiches or nipped out to the chippy, rather than eat dinner in the works canteen. People took it in turn to briefly introduce a topic for discussion. No subjects were barred, including politics and religion. In fact, they often proved to be the most popular and the most interesting. But other subjects were discussed. I remember a learned address on the art of beekeeping and the beneficial effects of eating honey, delivered by an articulate, unskilled labourer from the machine shop, whose role in the factory was to collect the swarf, that is, the metal turnings from lathes, drills, milling machines and the like, but who kept bees in hives on the railway embankment behind his home. There were many other subjects equally surprising. Thinking back to those times, I believe the most important and longest-lasting impact of the debates on me was to kindle an interest in history, not least that of Manchester and the surrounding area, in a way that school had completely failed to do. My older working-class debaters provided a vibrant picture of the fight of ordinary people to pull themselves out of poverty and to win the basic rights and liberties we enjoy today. They explained the background and the events leading up to the Peterloo Massacre, the ongoing struggles for the right to organise in unions, to exercise the right of assembly and freedom of speech. They informed me of the role of working-class publishers in the fight for a free press, how they defied the law and refused to pay the hated stamp duty on newspapers, the tax on knowledge, and served terms of imprisonment with hard labour as a result. In the process I learned how the Bishop of Exeter provided a voice in the House of Lords for local groups of churchmen who visited working-class reading rooms and coffee houses to seize unstamped newspapers and the works of Robert Owen, Thomas Paine, the poet Shelley, and other radicals, in order to initiate legal proceedings against those who published, printed, and distributed them. This self-same font of Christian virtue had received substantial financial compensation for having to free the 350 slaves he owned when slavery was finally abolished. So much for Christian virtue. The struggles against chattel slavery and the related struggle against wage slavery were featured, as were the campaigns of the Chartists and the suffragettes for the right to vote. We discussed the origins of Owenite socialism and the cooperative movement, and the not unrelated struggle for public education. I also learned who the main opponents to these quite reasonable and modest democratic reforms were. All too often it wasn't the landed aristocracy, or even their Tory party, as I had hitherto supposed. Instead, it was the upper middle-class manufacturers, the radical Whigs, and their successors in the Liberal Party. The history we discussed wasn't a dry-as-dust establishment regurgitation of dates and monarchs, but the unfolding story of the living and continuing struggles of the common people, the overwhelmingly very ordinary people who by their actions, and all too often, unfortunately, their inaction, are the real makers of history in any society.